So Jesse Miller has worked with lichens since 2007. He is currently working as the Washington State Rare Plant Botanist, providing scientific guidance on the conservation and management of the state's rare plants, lichens, and fungi. He previously taught ecology and statistics at Stanford. Earlier in his career, he worked as a field botanist and lichenologist in Oregon and California. He completed his PhD in plant ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2016. Jesse's research interests include the effects of global change factors, such as altered wildfire regimes and climate change on old-growth forest lichens. And so for more information, you can go to his website, jesseedmiller.com. So welcome. Perfect.
All right. Excellent. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thanks to all for coming out for an exciting evening of lichens. Could there be anything better? Probably, well, maybe, but this is pretty good, I think. Anyway, I'm excited to talk about how our lichens are doing here in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the research I was doing a few years ago when I was in California, because I think some of that, my major focus here is what's going on with our lichens in Oregon and Washington. But I think some of the things I've learned in my travels in the southern lands might be useful for helping us evaluate our current situation and the challenges we face. So it's a really exciting time to be working with lichens because we're in an era of some pretty major advances in lichenology. And I'm probably some or many people here have heard about the discovery that many of our lichens may have at least 3 obligate partners in the symbiosis rather than just 2 like we believed for a long time. And we're still figuring out what that means, and we're kind of coming to understand lichens in a whole new way. But maybe I should just start with a basic definition for anyone who's not familiar with lichens. Lichens are symbiotic organisms that are a partnership between at least one fungus and at least one photosynthesizing partner, which can be either algae or cyanobacteria or both. So it's a little bit more complex than the old description of lichens as just being a fungus and an algae living in symbiosis. It may be 3 or 4 or perhaps even more partners that all have to be there for the symbiosis to form. And lichens really weren't very well understood in the Pacific Northwest until the 1990s, when the Northwest Forest Plan led to a lot of lichen surveys being performed. After the whole spotted owl debate, many relatively obscure organisms came into the spotlight as part of the Northwest Forest Plan. And that's how we started developing a sense of what lichen species are common and what species are rare, and started thinking more about the conservation of our rare lichens. So I just, to kind of illustrate the current juncture we're at, this is a meme I created not too long ago, which is maybe a little much to digest all at once, but we're really questioning what lichens even are and how to understand them, which isn't necessarily something we have to fully wrap our brains around to talk about some of the basic conservation questions. But I do think it's interesting to point out that we're in this era of understanding lichens in a whole new way. So anyway, the lichens in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere face quite a few threats. And I know this may be an audience of mostly plant people. And you may be used to thinking about things like climate change and habitat loss, which are, of course, major threats to plants and animals and almost any organisms out there. But lichens are sensitive also to air pollution in a way that most other organisms aren't. And lichens are also very sensitive to severe fires in a way that many plants are not. Many plants have mechanisms to survive fires or to recolonize after fire. But lichens don't have any adaptations to fire that we know of. So on top of the threats that plants face, lichens may face some additional threats. And one habitat where lichens um, are particularly abundant and diverse is old growth forests. And that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. Of course, it's a habitat that's of interest to many of us just because they're beautiful and special and rare. But in addition to just having a lot of lichens, both in terms of species diversity and composition, there are also a number of lichens that are old growth obligates that we only find in old growth. And those are some of the lichens that I'm especially concerned about right now, and some of my colleagues as well are especially concerned about. I'm currently working as the lead state botanist for Washington State. So one part of my job is to evaluate the status of rare plants and rare lichens, as well as other organisms in Washington. And periodically, we update our state list of rare plants and lichens to try to reflect how our understanding of these species is changing, as well as how the species themselves are changing. Species can become rarer or become less rare as time goes on, of course. And so part of this process involves applying what we call conservation status rankings, which are numbers that we give species on a scale of 1 to 5 based on basically their level of extinction risk. So species that are ranked 1 are species that are critically imperiled or at high risk of extinction in the near future. Species that are ranked 5 are species that we consider relatively secure. And it turns out that these rankings that have been given to lichens seem to suggest that we don't need to worry too much about a lot of our lichens. For some of our old growth obligate lichens in the Pacific Northwest, the rankings are pretty high numbers, mostly 4s and 5s, suggesting that these lichens are pretty secure and there's no immediate risk of extinction. These rankings were assigned some time ago, probably at least based on older data, if the rankings themselves aren't older. One question I'm interested in coming into my current position and looking at where we are with lichen conservation, I'm interested in the question of whether these lichens are as secure as we seem to be assuming based on the rankings we've given them. And tonight I want to talk about some of the evidence for why maybe the rankings that the lichens currently have maybe don't fully reflect the current situation. One thing we know is that lichens can become extirpated from large areas where they've historically occurred. I lived in Wisconsin for a while when I was in grad school, and the common lungwort lichen, Loberia pulmonaria, historically was present throughout Wisconsin and was pretty common. And today, Loberia pulmonaria has been completely extirpated from southern Wisconsin. You have to go up into the Northwoods to find it. And even up there, it's not always looking great. I never saw one as beautiful as this photo I took in Oregon when I was in Wisconsin. And this story is common throughout the eastern U.S. and eastern North America. There are major lichen extirpations all over the place, partly because air pollution is much more pronounced there. And out here in the West, air pollution isn't as bad. In general, we have more intact natural habitats than the East does. And that may lead us to assume that our lichens are somewhat more resilient and maybe not at as much risk of extirpation as taxa in the East. But I think we need to examine that assumption a little bit more closely. We don't have a lot of data to support the idea that our lichens are doing fine, unfortunately. There was kind of a flourish of lichen surveys in the 1990s and very early 2000s in the heyday of the Northwest Forest Plan, but we haven't actually gone out to revisit a lot of our rare lichens in the last 20 years. And unfortunately, it's not clear that our rare lichens are doing very well. And I think one priority right now is to get out there and see how they're doing, which is kind of a challenge in itself. And one thing that brought this issue to my attention and the attention of some of my colleagues who I've been working on these questions with is the recent severe wildfires in Oregon, particularly the Labor Day fires of 2020, including the Beachy Creek fire, which burned Opal Creek, which I'm sure many people here know is one of the, well, I believe the largest old growth forests that remained in Oregon at the time. So this fire burned at pretty high severity. This is just one example of a before and after shot of how the landscape changed after the fire. And we believe that this was a forest that contained a lot of rare lichens. A substantial part of the rare lichen diversity of Oregon burned in this fire. And we believe that a lot of these populations were probably lost because lichens tend to burn up when they're high severity fires. And 2020 was really kind of an outlier in terms of area burned in Oregon. We saw just a huge amount of area burned. But there's certainly reason to believe that we're going to continue to have extreme fire years like this in the future. So this probably wasn't just a one-time thing. So what do we know about how lichens respond to fire? Which is, of course, one of the biggest threats that our rare lichens potentially face. To address that question, I want to talk about a little bit of research I've done in California over the last few years. And then I'll come back to the Pacific Northwest and talk about some of the current challenges we face with lichens. So I'm going to talk about two different projects I worked on in California. The first one is actually, I think I'm going to do these backwards. First, I'll talk about a little bit of research in areas that burned in several different fires in the Sierra Nevada. And then I'll talk about a little bit of research I did in lower lying country in Chaparral and Napa County in the North Coast Range of California. So starting with the Sierra Nevada, this project mostly took place in mixed conifer forests, which are forests that historically burned pretty frequently, mostly at low severity. So these were fires that primarily burned on the ground. They didn't kill a lot of trees. Most of the trees survived. And so these frequent fires probably were not killing most of the lichens. But because fire was suppressed for a century, more or less, following European colonization, fuels built up, and there's a lot more high severity fire or stand replacing fire where trees are killed in the Sierra Nevada today than there was historically. And this sets the stage for scenes like this. This is a photo I took after the Angora fire, which burned in 2007. I was actually just back there a week or two ago. I took this photo in 2016. The landscape looks almost exactly the same today. The forest was replaced almost entirely by shrublands in areas that burned at high severity. Of course, there were lichens in this forest historically, and you can see there's really not great habitat for tree-dwelling lichens in this area today. And this is a big issue throughout the Sierra Nevada. At the rate things are going, we could lose most of the forest in the Sierra Nevada within about 30 years, give or take, according to some recent analyses. So in this study, we visited a few fires that burned between 5 and 15 years prior to the time we sampled in the northern Sierra Nevada and up on the Modoc Plateau. And we established study plots across the full gradient of fire severity in areas that had burned in these fires. So so this is a map of fire severity. So areas that are red are areas that burned at high severity, where most of the trees were killed. And areas in lighter colors are areas that burned at lower severity, where more of the trees survived. So we established study plots, which are represented by these diamonds, across this whole gradient of fire severity to try to understand how fire affected the lichens. So we went out and we looked at the lichens in our study plots, which were big imaginary circles. And because a lot of the lichens are in the canopy, we collected litter fall, which is pretty representative of what's going on in the canopy. You can actually go around and pick up fallen branches and get a pretty good sense of what's happening up there. So this is a photo from one of our plots in a red fir forest in California. So what we found was that in areas that burned at lower severity, where most of the trees survived, lichen richness wasn't really affected. We didn't really see any effects of fire on the lichen community. But as fire severity increased towards stand replacing fire or high severity fire, we saw a major impact on the lichen communities. Almost all the lichens were gone in areas that burned at high severity. And even 15 or more years after the fires, there really wasn't much colonization at all in areas that had stand replacing fire. So one take-home message here is the effects of fire can be quite long-lasting on lichen communities. And then this is a figure showing the relationship between tree overstory cover or canopy cover and lichen richness. And we found a pretty strong relationship even in the dry, warm forests of the Sierra Nevada. And I think this graph would be, the line would be even steeper if we drew a graph like this for the Pacific Northwest. Our lichens up here are really adapted to cooler, wetter conditions. So losing the forest canopy is going to have an even harsher effect on them up here. So a few conclusions from this study were that high severity fire may really reduce lichen community for many decades, if not a century or longer. And it could even act as a catalyst for range shifts of lichens. It may be difficult for lichens to reestablish in places that have burned at high severity because conditions are hotter and drier. That said, it wasn't all bad news. We did find that lichens were able to survive low severity fire pretty well. We didn't really see any effect of lower severity fire on the lichens in the forest canopy, which suggests that lichens are probably resilient to thinning and prescribed fire. So management to reduce the occurrence of high severity fires, such as thinning dense stands that are denser than they were historically, and using prescribed fire as a management tool are likely to benefit lichen diversity, as well as prevent high severity fires that would be detrimental to lichen diversity. And then the second example I want to talk about here is a study from chaparral shrublands, which are a unique California ecosystem. Of course, we have some chaparral in Oregon. Ecologically, it's somewhat different from the shrub steppe we find on the east side of the mountains. But in Southern Oregon, we have some legitimate chaparral. Chaparral's an ecosystem that's quite adapted to fire. Chaparral shrublands typically burn at high severity when they burn. But the shrubs are often able to resprout or establish from seeds after the fire. So as long as fires don't burn too frequently, the main structural vegetation components of the community can come back pretty readily. And the concept of old growth chaparral is something that ecologists have debated for a long time. The question of whether there's any unique value to really old chaparral shrublands. There are still a lot of places on the landscape in California where we find shrubs that are over 100 years old. And while these may not be recognizable in the same way that redwood forests are recognizable as old growth, they really are extremely long-lived tree-like organisms. So that was one thing that informed that question was one thing that informed this study as well. And there are a number of rare lichens that can occur in chaparral. These are just a few examples. This photo here is Hypogymnia schizidiata. For anyone who knows hypogymnias, we have a lot of hypogymnias up here in Oregon and Washington. And Hypogymnia schizidiata is definitely the weirdest hypogymnia of all time. It's just totally beat up looking. It looks like it just had a terrible night, didn't get any sleep. Anyway, very, very cool, very rare chaparral lichen. So for this study, we had a really cool, what you might call a natural experiment. There were, this took place at two different University of California reserves, the Quail Ridge Reserve and the Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve. And there just happened to be this unique mosaic of fire histories, which are shown as the polygons here. Different areas on these reserves had burned at different times, ranging from just a few years prior to when we did our study to several decades in the past. And so this made it really easy for us to go out and sample areas that had burned at different times, and see how the lichens were doing. So what we found in this study was that lichen richness was really depressed for about the first 20 years after fire, but lichen richness mostly recovered about 20 to 30 years after fire, although it slowly continued to increase after that, up to 100 years or more after fire. But one interesting thing was that even though richness stabilized in just 2 or 3 decades, there were certain groups of lichen taxa that didn't come back for many decades. Some taxa were only found in the places that hadn't burned for over 60 years, including the cyanolichens, which are a group of particular conservation concern. So what we found was a lot of the species may come back relatively quickly, but there may be some things that take many, many decades or even a century to return. So what have we learned from all this? I mean, one of the most basic things is just that lichens burn up in high severity fires, which is maybe not that surprising, but it is in contrast to what we know about how plants respond to fire. A lot of plants can benefit from fire or have various strategies for recolonizing rapidly after fire or resprouting after fire. That's really not the case in lichens. High severity fire tends to wipe out all the lichens, and recolonization may be a very slow process. And for lichens that grow in forests, it's probably the case that trees have to regenerate before lichens can return. And this may not be really surprising news to people who, are used to looking at lichens on the landscape, but sometimes in ecology, the task is to prove the obvious because no one has done that before. So that's kind of how I feel about what we did here. So returning to the Pacific Northwest, one question I became interested in after doing all this research in California and seeing the effects of the 2020 fires on places like Opal Creek was I became curious, have a regionally significant number of rare lichen populations been lost in recent fires in the Pacific Northwest? And coming back to the conservation status rankings that have been assigned to some of our rare old growth obligate lichens, again, the current assumption, if you look at these rankings, seems to be that many of these taxa are relatively secure. And of course, these rankings haven't been updated since these fires happened. And one basic question I was curious about was how many of our rare lichen and old growth obligate lichen populations have we lost in these fires? Because, it just seemed like as a casual observer, we might have lost a significant number of our populations. So to address this question, I did a little spatial analysis and I looked at fires in Oregon and Washington. So this is a map of fires that burned just between 2000 and 2020. So, this isn't the whole history going back very far, but this is perhaps the era we might expect would have the greatest effect on contemporary lichen communities. So you can see, and this doesn't include this year's fires, which would expand the map at least somewhat in Oregon. But you can see we had a lot of fires in the Oregon Cascades, Southwest Oregon in the Siskiyous, major fire. Not so much fire in the Washington Cascades, and not as much fire in the Coast Ranges of either state. And so part of the question I was hoping to address from this study was whether we need to adjust the lichen conservation status rankings due to populations lost from fire. So to address this question, I kind of arbitrarily chose 6 lichen taxa that are associated with old growth forests. Kind of chose taxa that I like and am personally interested in. So, can't say this was totally objective, but I do think it's interesting. And then I used the fire data I just showed is from monitoring trends in burn severity. Um, and so this is an overlay of all the populations of the 6 old growth associated lichen taxa that I looked at on top of the fire layer here. So we could kind of assume all the places with the pink dots are places where you find forest stands with some degree of old growth character. This doesn't mean they're all truly old growth stands, but these are stands, at least mature forest stands where you're starting to get some of these taxa. And one thing you have to wonder about looking at this is, will we be having more fire in the Washington Cascades and in the Coast Ranges of both states in the upcoming future? I really think there's almost no way we won't. So that's just a future we have to be prepared for, and should be thinking about now from a conservation perspective. So this is just a figure showing some of the results of my simple spatial analysis, where I calculated how many of the populations of these lichens had burned at different fire severities. So each of these bars represents a species, and then purple is areas that were unburned, and then the other colors represent areas that burned. So yellow is areas that burned at high severity. And I won't go through all these individually, but one species, Stictoigalii, which just happens to be one of my very favorite lichens. A good common name for it is moon lichen. Very, very beautiful lichen, strict old growth forest obligate. We can see that nearly a quarter of the population's burned at high severity, which means they're probably gone. And that's a substantial number for a species that depends on forests that are many hundreds of years old. For that to happen, and remember, this is just a 20-year period of fire that I'm looking at here. And some of these other taxa didn't experience quite as much fire, but still a pretty substantial amount for a 20-year period. And another species I want to mention, Pseudocephalaria rainerensis, also experienced over 10% of its populations burning at high severity. And this is a species that we're already kind of worried about. And I guess I'll go ahead and move on to that. I think it's important to note that fire is not necessarily the only cause of lichen extirpations or the local extinction of lichen populations. In fact, there's been some really interesting work by some of my colleagues, Stephen Sherritt and Lolita Calabria, in Washington State. They've been revisiting populations of Pseudocephalaria rainerensis and have been unable to relocate a substantial proportion of populations. So it may be that these forests are experiencing what ecologists call extinction debt, where the fragmentation of the old growth forests into little remnant islands eventually causes the loss of some of the species that depend on that old growth forest habitat. And another lichen species that I'm really interested in also may be declining in places even in the absence of fire. And that species is Nephroma occultum, or cryptic paw lichen. This is a species that I first became familiar with when I was working on Willamette National Forest as a young botanist in 2008. And the Willamette is basically the heartland of Nephroma occultum. There's probably as much Nephroma occultum there as there is anywhere. And this is a photo of Nephroma occultum in the middle here, contrasted with a couple other common relatives, Loberia oregana and Loberia anomala. Other cyanolichens that often occur in the same habitats. But Nephroma occultum's, pretty distinctive looking. It's lighter in color than either of those, and it has these characteristic brown edges of the thallus. Very cool, very rare lichen, really a special thing to see. I feel very lucky I've got to see it several times. And this is a species that's rare throughout its range, and certainly rare in Washington, where I'm working today. It's ranked as vulnerable in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. It probably should be in Alaska too, although it's not ranked there. This is a map of all the known collections in the Lichen Herbarium database. So in Washington, we only have 13 occurrences of Nephroma occultum. I try to get in the practice of using common names because I know they're easier for people to get in their head. So cryptic paw lichen, if you prefer that, only 13 occurrences. And most of them were found in the 1990s or the very early 2000s. And most of them haven't been seen since then. So no one has gone to check on them or see how they're doing. And I actually went back to 6 of these populations this year, and I couldn't find it at any of the 6 sites. And it's a hard thing to detect. So there's no certainty that it's gone at those sites. I think we need to do multiple visits to be confident that those populations are really extirpated. But there's certainly reason to be concerned. You might imagine that we would see it at some of the sites, at least, if it really is still there. So I'm currently working on revising the Washington State rare lichen list, and this one will probably get bumped up from sensitive to threatened in the revised list, because there really is reason to be concerned about these populations. When these populations were found in the 1990s or early 2000s, many of these sites were much more continuous old growth forests. A lot of those old growth forests surrounding these populations have been logged. The stands where these lichens actually occur were not logged because they were found and protected under the Northwest Forest Plan. But being relegated to a very small island, isn't necessarily enough to allow these populations to survive in a matrix of a very young forest. So I want to wrap up here by just thinking about the future and talking about what some next steps might be for the challenges we face with some of our rare lichens. We know that we're going to continue to have large fires and probably a lot of high severity fire. British Columbia set its record for annual area burned this year, and it actually set the record quite early in the year, like in July, I think, or maybe even earlier than that. So, British Columbia really had an unprecedented fire year. In Washington, and we really didn't have a very bad fire year. Of course, Oregon had some major fires this year, but not like some previous years we may recall. You have to wonder what's coming, though. It's hard to imagine we aren't going to see major fires in the Cascades of Washington at some point in the near future. And so from a management perspective, in the wet forests of the Western Cascades, where we get lichens like Nephroma occultum, cryptic paw lichen, we have more limited management options. In dry forests in the Eastern Cascades, similar to the dry forests in California, we can thin the stands that are denser than they were historically. We can do these fuels treatments. We can do prescribed fire, and that can largely prevent high severity fire from occurring. And of course, those are forests that historically burn mostly at low severity. In the wetter Western Cascades, those tools, we don't quite have such powerful tools. Of course, there are certain things we can do, but the solution isn't quite as clear here as it is in the drier forests, in my personal and professional opinion. So we're going to continue to see some high severity fire in our forests, although of course, we should take the steps we can, in my opinion, to reduce high severity fire. But what can we do? And I think it's interesting for inspiration to look at what's going on in the vascular plant conservation world in the Pacific Northwest right now. And one iconic example, maybe the most controversial rare plant in the Pacific Northwest in our time, is golden paintbrush, which I'm sure many people here are familiar with. Golden paintbrush was quite imperiled. And there was a major restoration effort where seeds were planted in a bunch of prairies in the Puget Trough and Willamette Valley. And this really increased the number of golden paintbrush plants on the landscape. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually delisted golden paintbrush. So it's no longer a species that's federally endangered anymore. And many botanists in the Northwest think that this delisting was somewhat preliminary. There's not complete confidence that it's totally recovered. There's no question that these efforts did increase the number of plants on the landscape. There is certainly at least a positive part to this story, even though the story isn't completely resolved yet. And there's nothing like this going on for lichens at all. No one is going out and trying to manipulate these species and trying to help these species get to habitats where they can thrive. One thing we know about a lot of our rare lichens in the Northwest is they tend to be dispersal limited or establishment limited. So they're not necessarily good at dispersing to new sites. So if we want to continue to have these rare taxa in our forests, after eliminating almost all the habitat for them on the landscape, it may be really helpful to move some of these species around and move them to suitable stands where they are not already present. And that's my perspective. Another challenge we face is monitoring. We just don't have anyone who's going out to look at these species. Land management agencies like the Forest Service only do surveys if they're planning some kind of management project like a timber sale. But there's no one going out and doing just routine monitoring, except for the few days that I could spend and maybe a few other people who are just interested in this of their own volition. So what do we need to do? There are real solutions to the problems we face. More monitoring is going to be super useful. It's something we should invest in. I think we should consider doing manipulative management, similar to what we're doing with a lot of our rare vascular plants. We can move these species around, and we could probably help them thrive in maturing second growth stands that are totally suitable for them, but are places that they wouldn't naturally disperse to. There's certainly some forest management steps we could take to reduce fire severity, and perhaps speed the return to old growth conditions. Some of our really dense overplanted second growth stands could benefit from being thinned. Of course, that's happening to some extent. But finally, it's been really clear to me in my current position how powerful the Endangered Species Act is for bringing attention and resources to our rare species. And currently, we only have 2 lichens that are federally listed under the Endangered Species Act in the US, and they're both eastern species. One's in Florida and one's in Appalachia. We don't have any western lichens listed, even though we have lichens that are certainly rare enough to deserve listing by any standard. So perhaps one of the most important things we could be doing is working to submit petitions to get some of our lichens federally listed. That's one thing that stood out to me, looking at what kind of what happens to species after they get federally listed. While success isn't guaranteed, they have a much better shot once those resources are being directed towards them. But again, monitoring is a real challenge. We just don't have anyone going out to look at these taxa and see what's going on. So one thing I'm thinking about these days is, can community science play a role in tracking our rare lichens? In Washington, we have the Rare Care program, which has been tremendously successful in helping us monitor vascular plants. And one thing I've been thinking about is just the idea of getting interested people who want to volunteer to go visit some of our rare lichens out in the field to help out with this. Not only visiting known populations, but also surveying old growth habitat areas that haven't necessarily been thoroughly surveyed. Because we know that areas tend to get surveyed only when timber sales are proposed. So the areas that haven't been logged haven't necessarily been thoroughly surveyed for rare lichens. So these are some of the steps that I'm thinking about to move forward. If you think you could learn to distinguish Nephroma occultum from these 2 lichens it's growing next to, maybe you could help us go look for some of these lichens in our old growth forests. And maturing second growth forests. So that's everything I have tonight. Thanks everyone for listening. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right. Wow. Thank you, Jesse, for that talk. That was great. Really interesting. So yeah, we'll start going through questions. Feel free for everyone in the audience to put those in as you come up with them. So are you ready for some questions?
I'm ready. I'm so ready.
Okay. So Teresa asked, is nephroma found on both state and federal lands?
Great question. I'm so I it's mostly federal, it's mostly Forest Service, but I believe there's one population on DNR land, if I recall correctly. And that's in Washington. I work in Washington right now, so I have a Washington bias. I mean, Oregon doesn't have as much state land. There's not the state forests are much smaller in Oregon. I I don't know. There may not be any populations in state forests in Oregon, but I'm not totally sure.
Okay, let's see. Devin says, do old growth dependent lichens grow only on old trees or also on younger trees and stands with old trees?
Great question. So we I've done some research on Loberia oregana, which is not a strict old growth obligate, but it's certainly an old growth associate, something you typically find in old growth stands. And we've found that it can certainly be on small trees in old growth stands. Small trees aren't always young trees. You can have pretty old trees that are stunted in the shade and don't get very big. And it's often hard to age small trees accurately in the field in old growth stands. So I'd say if you're out in the old growth stand, it's worth taking a look at the smaller trees. You're probably not going to know what's a young tree versus an old tree in the small trees either. But yeah, it's worth taking a look. If you're in the right environment, there very well could be old growth associated lichens on smaller trees.
That makes sense. Let's see here. Erica says, do you anticipate any job opportunities for surveying lichen?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question, and I think that brings up an important issue. And we see a lot of successful volunteer programs going on to monitor our rare taxa, but the downside of the volunteer programs, and I'm a huge fan of these volunteer programs, but I do think it's really important to be building the next generation of professional botanists. And if we don't have paid positions, we're not doing that. So I do think it's very important to have paid positions doing this kind of work. For younger people, I mean, the only reason I'm doing this work is because I was able to get work that paid decently for my whole adult life doing this work, or else I'd be doing, I certainly would have moved on to something else by now. And those jobs aren't always abundantly available. So I do think that's something we need to think about, is how do we get funding for this work to continue training and employing the next generation of botanists? And that was really the beauty of the Northwest Forest Plan after the spotted owl controversy. Prior to that, there were no jobs doing lichen surveys on our federal lands, and no one was out there looking at the species day to day. And the Northwest Forest Plan created a whole bunch of jobs all over the Northwest where people were out, and that's what I did when I was, when I took those photos of Nephroma occultum 15 years ago. I was working as a seasonal botanist, doing these surveys under the survey and manage program of the Northwest Forest Plan. And we're starting to see those surveys seem to ebb. It's a little bit concerning, because those surveys really do provide the essential biological data that we need. So yeah, I don't have a great answer to that question, but I do think that's something we really need to think about seriously in the conservation community. Yeah, we
Agreed.
do need to continue training the next generation of botanists.
All right. Ash Gill says, I'm curious what might be happening on the genomic side of things. Is there any concern of mutational load in these fractured populations due to drift and inbreeding? And if so, is there concern that the founder effect of translocation could compound these issues?
Great question. Smart question. Yeah, not really my thing personally. I can't speak to that, but fortunately, I have some really smart colleagues who are addressing those questions. Currently with Pseudocephalaria rainerensis, or what should we call that? Mount Rainier specklebelly lichen, which is one of our other true old growth obligates, rare old growth obligates besides Nephroma occultum. So there is a study in the works right now. I've heard like a brief summary of the results, but I can't recite it off the top of my head. But stay tuned, that will be coming out, and I agree those are really important things to think about. So yeah, thanks for the question. Keep an eye on Stephen Sherritt, Jesse Allen, and Lolita Calabria, because something's going to be brewing in the near future.
All right. Paul asks, is it possible to do some grant writing to support botanists from public agencies, and private lichenologists is included in that, to go out and monitor lichens during times of years that they might otherwise be employed? Make that times of year that might be unemployed.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, that's a great question. That's one of the beautiful things about working with lichens is they're there year round and they don't really change seasonally. So you can go out anytime and see the lichens. So it's true, when you're a botanist who works with vascular plants during the field season, winter is a great time to get out and look at the lichens. Yeah, I think finding funding sources for work like that would be really, really important. And personally, as someone who worked as a seasonal botanist for many years, getting winter work to get you through the cold season, it can be a real challenge. You don't necessarily make enough during the summer to support yourself, and that could be huge for recruiting more people into the botanical lifestyle. So yeah, I don't have I think we'd have to strategize a little bit about where that money could come from, but we're living at the peak of the empire. There's money out there. If we can just befriend Jeff Bezos or something, there's certainly ways to make it happen. So yeah, great question. I think that would be a fantastic thing to think about more.
All right. Another question from Devin. Are any of the lichens smoke sensitive? Seems like all the species in Southwest Oregon at least should be adapted, but could be quite sensitive to air pollutants.
Yeah, and this is a question I get a lot that I don't have a great answer for. But that won't stop me from speculating. um, so I think the thing that we have going for this is that lichens are dormant when they're dry. They become metabolically active when they're hydrated, and that's when they photosynthesize and go about all their life processes. But when they're dry during the fire season in the summer, they're dormant and they're not really soaking in the air in the way that they do the rest of the year. And of course, the rest of the year, they're very sensitive to air pollution. And there still may be some deposition from smoke onto the lichen thallus, which will ultimately get soaked in, once they hydrate and start photosynthesizing, when the fall rains come. But it may not be as severe as we might expect once you factor in the fact that the lichens are dormant during the smoky season. It may be that most of the smoke just blows away after a few days and there's relatively little residue. But I do think that's a really important question that needs more research. And I hope someday I can do more work on that, because I do think that's something we really need to understand better.
Okay. Kind of going off of that, do lichens record air quality?
Yeah, lichens are widely used for monitoring air quality. Lichens soak up the pollutants in the air around them. And there are a couple different methods you can use. You can actually look at what lichens are present at a site and make a coarse estimate of air quality based on that. Or you can take lichen tissue and grind it up and analyze it and get a more precise estimate of air pollution levels. And you can actually look at each individual pollutant when you do that. So you can look at nitrogen and sulfur, but also stuff like heavy metals. And there's a huge body of work using lichens and mosses as well, which are similar in that they also soak up what's in the air around them. So yeah, very probably the most cost-efficient way to monitor air pollution in places where there are suitable lichens and mosses.
All right, looks like what a last. Let's see. Is there another one? What do you think about the livelihood of our lichens in the urban landscape, like in our gardens? Anything we can do to preserve slash conserve the lichen we have in our urban landscape?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'm a huge fan of native plant gardening in the urban environment. We know that can make a big difference for supporting native pollinators and stuff like that. Um, it kind of comes back to air pollution. It may be hard to grow our more sensitive lichens in urban environments just because it's really hard to, you really can't create an urban garden that has cleaner air than your greater neighborhood has, right? I mean, the air pollutants are ambient and they just move around. So that may be a limiting factor. It may be difficult to produce a really pristine lichen community like you'd find in some mountain landscape in your yard. But there are certainly a lot of lichen taxa you can grow in a place with, that has moderate air pollution. So yeah, I say play around with it and see what works. I think one big question we need to learn more about is just how can we go about translocating lichens, growing lichens. So I encourage everyone to try to grow some lichens in their yard. I think that's a great idea.
All right. Trey asked, any novel ideas on changing public sentiment towards targeted beneficial management in older, not old growth stands?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, great question. I'm not sure public sentiment is that negative towards it, but I think that's an interesting question. We know, in the Northwest, the classic scenario is areas that were, a lot of our forest, I mean, all of our forest lands were at one time old growth forest. A lot of those were logged. They were often replanted with dense stands of trees. And in some cases, not much more management happened after that. And we just ended up with these really dense stands of trees that are perhaps much denser than they were historically. And we know that going in and thinning those overplanted stands can help us reproduce old growth conditions much more rapidly. It's going to take a long time for those stands to thin themselves. So the science behind that is pretty solid at this point.
Mm.
And there is a contingent out there that opposes any tree cutting at all. And, thinks that, even a restoration project that's a non-commercial project, no one's making a profit off of it. There are people who will go out and protest those projects and don't make any distinction between a commercial old growth timber sale and a restoration project that's thinning a dense young stand to restore old growth conditions. So I think and there's some there's a handful of very loud people who are promoting this preservationist worldview where cutting any tree is destroying the earth. And I think it's just really important that we continue to educate people and speak up. And it kind of is, in my opinion, it's based in kind of a colonialist mindset. The idea of nature being this untouched thing that's free from human influence, when in fact we know that indigenous people in North America and everywhere else have been managing these ecosystems for thousands of years. The idea of nature being something untouched by humans really doesn't make sense once we look at the historical context. In my opinion, there's a role for human influence in a lot of ecosystems. So yeah, I think it's important to spread that word around. And for these the small number of loud people who are promoting this harmful preservationist message, I do think it's important for people to speak up, not allow those messages to stand because they are really harmful, in my opinion.
All right. Well, I think one of our last questions, what is lichen's role in our habitat? Do certain trees attract more lichens than others?
Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty interesting, actually. Many different tree species will have distinctive communities of lichens that are associated with that tree species. And at a broad scale, there's some differences between hardwoods, conifers, but even within species within those groups, you can see a lot of distinctions. Um, yeah, and I encourage you, even if you don't know a lot about lichens, go out and just look at what's growing on different trees, and you'll start to see some patterns, even if you don't know the names of them. But yeah, lichens, and just to briefly answer the role question, lichens play a lot of different roles in our ecosystems. Um, they provide, everyone cares about animals, so I always like to point out, there are animals that eat lichens. That's, if you don't care about lichens, surely you will care if you know that animals eat them, right? There's birds that make nests with lichens. There's a whole group of diverse invertebrates that live their whole lives in and on lichens. We have large charismatic megafauna like caribou that will travel hundreds of miles in the boreal regions to find the best lichens to eat. So yeah, once you start looking more closely, everything goes back to lichens eventually, in my opinion.
Oh yeah. Do lichens only grow on trees?
No, they don't. And I understand that my talk may have given that perspective because that's what I was focused on. But no, there are great lichens growing on all kinds of things. Almost lichens can grow on almost any stable substrate in the Pacific Northwest. They don't like things that move around a lot, but you can get really interesting lichens on rocks. There are a lot of lichens that grow on soil, biological soil crusts, especially out in drier parts of
Mhm.
the Pacific Northwest. Um, and really all kinds of other substrates. There are lichens that grow on the leaves of plants. There are lichens that grow on fence posts, can actually be a great place to look at lichens in certain environments.
Hmm.
Yeah, you'll really see them all kinds of places once you start looking.
All right. Let's see if we have any more here.
As an aside, there are a few lichens that grow on beetle elytra as the beetles walk around in the forest as camouflage.
Oh.
Okay. And then maybe the beetles like kind of using the lichens perhaps.
Oh yes, it's a camouflage. The lichens grow on the long-lived beetles.
Hmm.
Very cool. Well, I mean, I'd heard of them growing on giant tortoises, but had not heard about the beetles.
Let's see. One more question. I was also curious about this question. You talked a lot about transplanting lichens, but is there literature or anything like resources that you can recommend on like how to propagate lichens or even, move them around?
Yeah, I think this is something that's not super well documented, and I think this is
Okay.
a really important question if we're going to undertake some of these conservation ideas that I've suggested.
Mhm.
Um, I have some colleagues who have been looking into this. There's hopefully going to be a review paper coming out synthesizing lichen
Mm,
propagation methods
okay.
at some point. But yeah, no promises. But the big take home message, as I understand it, is the lichen propagation seems to work best when you use entire lichens, when you try to move entire lichens around, or at least use larger pieces of lichens.
Hmm.
There's this whole idea that you can blend lichens up in a blender with buttermilk and perhaps certain other ingredients, and then paint that solution on surfaces and get lichens to grow. And the impression I have from talking to my colleagues is that may not work. I mean, it may work better for mosses, but it may not work great for lichens,
Hmm.
despite there being some mythology around that. So, my current impression is moving entire lichens or large pieces of lichens around is probably going to be your best bet. And let the natural world take care of growing them for the first part of their lives.
Mhm.
But that it's something we certainly need to look into more, because there probably are ways to cultivate them more efficiently than what we know about now, and that could be really useful for restoration.
Right. So opportunities abound on that front. Let's see. We got. Are you currently working with any university students on lichen research?
Um, yeah, well, so I am collaborating with Stephen Sherritt, who's doing some of the really cool work revisiting some of these old growth lichen populations. But yeah, I would love to be involved with other university students who are interested in this. So if any university students who want to work with lichens are listening, I'd love to talk to you and see if we can find ways to collaborate. I definitely think working with students is probably one of the most useful ways I can contribute to this kind of work.
All right, Mary just came up with a new question. Are lichens critical to their ecosystems? What happens when they disappear?
Yeah, great question. I wish everyone was asking these kinds of questions out there in America today. So my colleagues and I have sometimes called this cryptic biodiversity loss, where if you have a forest and you lose the lichens, it still looks like a forest, but there are these small pieces that are missing that aren't necessarily obvious. But the consequences of that can potentially be pretty substantial. And just to give one example, the spotted owl is perhaps the most well-known animal of conservation concern in the Pacific Northwest. And spotted owls, one major food source for spotted owls is flying squirrels. And flying squirrels eat a diet that contains a substantial amount of lichens in it. So if we lose lichens in forests, that could potentially scale up to affect food availability for spotted owls. So that's just one example, but these small organisms that we often overlook may, if they disappear, they may have really major consequences for many components of the ecosystem that we do see.
Interesting. Well, I had a question, so I'm gonna.
All right.
You talk a lot about the Northwest Forest Plan, and how like that created a lot of jobs in that time, and people were monitoring things. We were kind of really up to date with what was going on in the forest. That was done a long time ago. Is there a movement to kind of update that or get a new one going?
That's a great question. I don't know of anything like that. And we're in this weird situation where there is this component of the environmental groups that are focused on these really hardcore preservationist worldviews. And then where I guess that's a good question. Where is the effort to have a new Northwest Forest Plan? I don't really have a great answer for that, but I think that's a really interesting question. And
It
I
just
think
feels
that's
like a
something
lot
to
of
think about.
science has happened in between, the 1980s and now. So
Oh yeah, we have a whole new handle on what's going on in our forests.
Yeah.
I mean, when they made the original lists of rare species under the Northwest Forest Plan, some of those species turned out to be things that were super common, but it was just like no one had gone out to look for them. So, we've learned a whole lot about our forests. I mean, I certainly do have the sense that our rare species are receiving pretty good protections right now. Once species are rare enough to receive federal listing, they're certainly going to get a lot of attention and protection. I don't think a lot of we don't really have to worry. Old growth logging is still happening here and there. In general, on federal land, our rare stuff like rare lichens or rare plants and old growth stands is probably going to be protected. But old growth is still being logged faster than it's growing back. So I think that's a interesting question. And I see this comment that the forest plan is being rewritten now.
Oh yeah. I'm seeing that now too. Okay. I think that was all the questions that we had in the chat.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Really appreciate the great Q&A there. Really excellent questions. And I guess one last thing to mention is I do like to lead lichen field trips now and then. So for those of you who are really into it, feel free to send me an email, and if we get a chance, maybe we can go out in the field and look at some lichens together at some point.